welcome everybody. My name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, and this is the 2014-2015 Linus Pauling Memorial Lectures. And it's the institute that organizes this, but it would not happen without our wonderful co-sponsors. And my first task here is to thank the co-sponsors. In particular, first off, our main corporate co-sponsor for a number of years is Mentor Graphics Corporation. I think they have their banner up. We were privileged to have Wally Rines introduce the last speaker, who was Wally's the chairman and president. I can't remember, they split up the names of Mentor Graphics. Nice guy. He knew Esther Dyson from before. Those who weren't here last time, you don't know. So other co-sponsors, Oregon Episcopal School, FEI Company, Rockwell Collins, Portland State University, Onami, who's our nanotech guys, really, they're big job creators, Portland Community College, Clark College in Vancouver, Clackamas Community College, and Albina Community Bank. And then last but not least, Mentor Graphics Foundation gives us money to subsidize tickets for high school and community college students, and that's a big plus. So thank you to all those guys. I got to introduce Joe, but I decided I had to do this one thing because, so you know, I'm a philosopher. I pretend to be a philosopher anyway. And so the question is, how did we get to this situation that we're in? And so I had this little thing. So you see it up here. This is Prometheus and Epimetheus. So where we're at now, I mean, the specifics are new, but the message that Plato and Hesiod sent us from a couple thousand years ago, 2,500 years ago or so. So they did it in myths. So they'd make up these myths, but these myths were like Aesop's fables. They had sort of morals to them, the moral of the fable and so forth. So what was it? So basically, Zeus is now the great god. He's dominated everything, and the Titans, he's conquered them. And so these two Titans, he's making the world, he's creating the world now. And these two Titans, these Prometheus and Epimetheus, and he says, look, I want you to go, make the animals and the plants and the fish and all that sort of stuff. And so they're kind of doing that. And the Prometheus is kind of like, he's a real craftsman, and he's making the human body. So he's down there with the clay, and he's kind of making, and he decides to make him in the image of the gods, which is cool. And he's really meticulous about this. Now his brother Epimetheus is not, he's not going to win the Nobel Prize. And Epimetheus is given the assignment of handing out all the skills, the talent, the knowledge to the different. So birds are going to need to know how to fly, right? So, and the fish are going to know how to swim, and the plants do their things, and the bugs and so forth. So he's going around handing out all these, gifts for the gods, how to do this and how to do that. And finally gets it all done, and then finally goes back to his brother, Prometheus, and he says, well, I'm kind of done. And Prometheus says, great, that's good. And he said, now what did you save, of the gifts that you had? What did you save for the humans? And he goes like, uh-oh, I forgot the humans. And he'd given all this away. So the moral of the story is that all the animals, I like that the continental existentialists had this idea that you have the ability to act in the world. This is a good human experience. You have the ability to act in the world, but there's no script. What the hell am I supposed to do? So this is the message of things. So birds know what to do, fish know what to do, they have all this stuff, they have foresight, okay? But humans, we don't know what to do. So humans have to learn how to get along in the world and develop our world. And so humans learn by hindsight. Humans have hindsight. So the idea is there's this other British thing that the Americans always come up with the best solution after they've tried all the other possibilities. So we're in this situation, the Great Divide, as Joe's going to talk about tonight. So I just wanted to say, I think this is the message. So how did we get here? We're kind of trying to figure out how did we get here, and as we figure it out and go, then we're going to come up with how we're going to get out of this. So anyway, Joe Stiglitz doesn't need a lot of introduction. Nobel Prize in Economics. He's a university professor at Columbia University. He writes a lot. He just did a whole series in New York Times about what's been going on and stuff like that. Great thinker, great economist, and so here he is.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in Portland again. If we ever needed any evidence about the great divide that's been splitting our society apart, the riots that have afflicted Baltimore this week, I think, typifies and it demonstrates the kind of divide that has been splitting America apart. When you write something, you sometimes actually like some people to criticize you, because at least it means you were not banal, that you actually said something. So last week, I almost welcomed when the Wall Street Journal complained, saying that I was complaining too much about inequality. I think their view was that we had too little inequality, and their real complaint was that I thought we had too much inequality. So what I want to do this evening is talk a little bit about the dimensions of inequality, the causes, how we got where we are today, the country with the highest level of inequality of any of the advanced countries. In the introduction, they were talking about myths. And one of the myths that's very strong in America, and a lot of people outside of America actually believe, that we are the land of equal opportunity. But the striking thing is that we actually have lower levels of opportunity, a lower level of equality of opportunity than almost any other advanced countries. So I'm going to try to explain that and to explain how it was that we've gotten here, some of the consequences, and mostly what we can do about it. That will follow very, very directly from my diagnosis of the problem. Let me begin by talking just a little bit, though, about how I got engaged in this particular subject. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, an industrial town on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. It typified, in many ways, it was a quintessentially story of American industrialization. It was founded in 1906 by U.S. Steel. And it was such a company town that the name of the city, Gary, is the city is named after the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. Now that's really a company town for you. What I didn't know when I was growing up was that this was the golden age of capitalism. I only found out that later, because when I was growing up, what I saw was rampant racial discrimination, high levels of inequality, and episodic unemployment. My classmates' parents would be laid off every 3-4 years as the economy went into another slump, and we seemed to be unable to manage the economy in a stable way. And it was these concerns about unemployment, about inequality, that motivated me when I later went to college. Originally, I had intended to major in physics, a real science, but I was much more interested in the social problems that I had seen growing up and these inequities, so that I switched to economics, went to MIT, wrote my thesis under Bob Solow, who interestingly had written his thesis, another Nobel Prize winner, had written his thesis on distribution of income and wealth. One has to understand that at that point in time, and for the subsequent 40 years, the subject of inequality was almost never discussed among economists. Many economists, for instance, Bob Lucas at the University of Chicago, who also got a Nobel Prize, reflect a sentiment that was widespread in the economics profession, that echoed in a way Mitt Romney said in the last election. And remember, he said, you should only talk about inequality in quiet voices in closed rooms. And you could understand why he might think that. But Bob Lucas actually argued that it was poisonous to talk about inequality, that economists should focus on one thing, economic efficiency, increasing the size of the pie, and not worry about how the pie was divided, that those two ideas were totally separable. We now know how wrong that perspective was, and the influence of ideas like those emanating from Chicago has been, I think, very bad for the shaping economic policy. And what I'm going to try to do is describe some of the ways in which that happened. So I wrote my thesis at MIT on the distribution of income, and the key chapter of my thesis was entitled "The Distribution of Income and Wealth Among Individuals," was published in Econometrica. It's still, I modestly think, the best theoretical analysis of the subject, but the readership wasn't that great. But a few years ago, Vanity Fair asked me to write something that was a little bit more accessible. And I wrote an article. This title of the article really summarizes some of the key ideas that are in this book, The Great Divide. The title of the article was "Of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%. And you can get a little bit of a flavor of what I was saying in that article. The article did go viral and did get more readers than my Econometrica paper did. In this collection, this book is a collection of many of my essays that I've written with trying to put it in a context, try to bring it up to date, try to talk to tell a narrative about what has happened in the United States. But after I wrote the Vanity Fair article, the New York Times asked me to curate a column, a series in the New York Times on the Great Divide. And I think it has helped finally bring the issue of inequality to the fore. And I'll give you a lot of depressing statistics this evening. You should leave here not feeling very good, but I want to mention a few things that every once in a while give me hope. One of them is that the issue of inequality, well, one of them is that there are so many people here listening to me, that the issue of inequality has risen to the top of the political agenda, that it's going to be, I believe, a key issue in this coming election in 2016, that even the Republicans are beginning to talk about it. I'm not sure whether they're, like the Wall Street Journal, whether they're going to try to devise policies to increase it. But at least we're going to have a national debate about it. And that's why it means it's important to have some understanding of the nature of this inequality and how it's come about. So what I want to share with you this evening is several of the ways in which our understanding of inequality has really changed dramatically in the last, say, five years or 10 years. One of them relates to the remark I made very briefly about growing up in Gary, Indiana, and that being the golden age of capitalism. Another great Nobel Prize winner, Simon Kuznets, who was the person who helped develop the national income accounts that we measure. You know, it says that GDP, what's happening to our national output, GDP. He enunciated what's since been called Kuznets' law. He didn't call it Kuznets' law, but his idea was that in
early stages of development, inequality increased, the result of some parts of any economy, society pulling out, growing faster than others, and that opens up a divide. But then his argument was that as a country developed, those parts that were behind, the lagging parts, started to catch up, and that divide would narrow. And that particular story actually was very descriptive of what happened in the United States up to the time that he was writing. So inequality did grow in the early years of the United States, but then, particularly beginning around 1930 and even more after World War II, inequality came down very dramatically. So in the period that he was writing, he could see that this inequality was falling, and similar patterns were happening in other countries. He anticipated and argued that this would continue, but it didn't. Beginning around 1980, inequality started to soar in the United States. The top 1% saw the share of their income that they got double. The top 1/10 of 1% saw their share increase 3 to 4-fold. And so the question naturally arises, how do we account for this change? And there are two hypotheses, and they're not necessarily inconsistent, that have been put forward. One was that the period, this golden age of capitalism, the period after World War II, was unusual. And it was unusual in many respects. The country had just fought a war. That fighting together brought the country together. And there was a kind of national cohesion. The result of this were all kinds of investment in education, in infrastructure, in the national highway system, in technology, the response to the Sputnik. Many of you may not remember, many of you may not have been born at the time, but that the top marginal tax rate during the Eisenhower years, this is a Republican, during the Eisenhower years was 91%. If you hear the current debate, the story is that if we increased taxes at the top from 36 to 39, the economy would fall apart. Well, it didn't. But the point was, this period when the top marginal tax rate was 91% was the period of our fastest economic growth. And it was a period in which the economy grew together. Every part of our society saw incomes increase, but those at the bottom saw their incomes increase the most. And so we created shared prosperity, the middle-class society, the first middle-class society, the kind of middle-class society that we still think we are, but we aren't. So that's one hypothesis was that time moved on and that national cohesion that had brought us together weakened, and that by the 1980s, the war, World War II, and the fighting together seemed a distant past. Something else, though, happened around 1980, and that was the 70s had been a very difficult period for the country. We had high inflation, mainly a result of some oil price shocks, wasn't well managed. And there were some people who said that we needed to try a different set of policies. The ideas that came up were called supply-side economics, many of them emanating from the University of Chicago, not to name any university to blame. But when these ideas were first put forward, I thought they were bonkers, to use a technical term. The evidence against this, the theory against it, were overwhelming. But the country decided to try this, well, called experiment. Two key ingredients. You lowered the top tax rate. Remember, from 91, it went down to something like 35%. That was supposed to provide incentives, And then one other thing, deregulation. Take away the regulations, and that would free the economy up, and those two together, incentives plus freeing up the economy, would lead the economy to grow faster. The argument was put, yes, it would lead to more inequality, have to, but that the size of the national pie would grow so much that even those in the middle and bottom would see a bigger piece of a pie. Well, we now have a third of a century of results about this experiment. The title of this of the institute that has invited me to give the talk is about science and policy. If you do an experiment over 30 years, over a third of a century, you get some data. So we know a little bit about this experiment, and I think we can declare after a third of a century that it was a dismal failure. The one part of the experiment, the one part of what they said that was accurate was that we did get a lot more inequality. That part of the forecast was true. But the income, the growth that had been forecast didn't happen. In fact, the economy grew much slower than it did in the period that we had this kind of social cohesion, this period of shared prosperity after World War II. In fact, the growth was so poor and the inequality was so great that large fractions of Americans saw no increase in their income. In fact, if you look, say, at the middle, the median income has stagnated now for more than a quarter of a century when adjusted for inflation. But things at the bottom are even worse. Minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is today the same as it was basically 45 years ago. So we talk about a great economy, but the only way you can assess, what is a good economy, it's one where the benefits of the growth are such that most citizens see an increase in their standard of living. In those terms, America's economy is a failed economy. And can you imagine going for almost a half century with no pay increase? I suspect most of us don't work for a half century. I'm celebrating 50 years of my teaching next year, so a few of us do, but typically, but can you imagine working for 50 years and getting at the end of 50 years the same pay that you had in the beginning? It's a kind of exploitation that should be unimaginable. It's not as if productivity didn't increase over that half century. In fact, the productivity of American workers over the last 35, 40 years has actually more than doubled, but their wages have stagnated. So this is unusual. We talk about American exceptionalism. This is an aspect of American exceptionalism that historically and in most other countries, when productivity increases, wages increase in tandem. But it hasn't been happening here. And so the question is, why? And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. A second big insight, a second big way in which our understanding of inequality has changed relates to the idea of the trade-off. Economists like to talk about trade-offs. Arthur Okun, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a very famous book which was called The Big Trade-Off, in which he argued that, yes, inequality was a bad thing, but the only way to reduce inequality was to give up on economic performance. And so it posed a question, a difficult choice for our society. Now we know that that's not true. At least when we get to inequality in the extremes that has happened in the United States, when we have a situation where the large fractions of a population have seen income stagnate for a quarter century or more, when we come to understand the way that inequality has been generated, we come to understand that actually we could have more growth, better economic performance, and less inequality. And this is not just a view that somebody on the left like me has. This has now become a mainstream view. Some of you may know that in earlier books I've very strongly criticized the International Monetary Fund. It's not exactly a, quote, liberal institution. It's been basically dominated by financial markets. But they've been seriously studying for a number of years the determinants of good economic performance, growth, stability. And they've come to the conclusion that economies with high levels of inequality, like that in the United States, perform more poorly, have lower growth and more instability. Not only have they concluded that, it's very interesting to watch the managing director of the IMF, the head of the IMF, go around the world preaching this. I've been in China where there is a concern about growing inequality. And I've been at meetings with top leaders of China where she explained to them why it was that inequality is such a threat to their continuing economic growth and why they have to do something about it. I only wish that, IMF is on 19th Street in Washington. I only wish that people in the rest of Washington listened to what she was saying. The third basic idea I want to talk about has to do with two concepts: inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity. When the discussions on inequality first began, say, 10 years ago, some people on the right, like Pat Ryan, would say, we don't care about inequality of incomes. We don't care about inequality of outcomes. What defines America is equality of opportunity. The only thing that he didn't realize that we weren't doing very well in that regard either. Now the question is, how do we measure inequality of opportunity? Most of us know people who've made it from the bottom to the top. So America does provide opportunity. We all know immigrants that come here and succeed. But from a social perspective of a social scientist, what we mean by equality of opportunity is what are the life chances, what are the probabilities? Not an isolated example of somebody making it from the bottom to the top, but how likely is it to happen? And in those terms, the life chances of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced country. So the idea of America being a land of opportunity is a myth. And we often contrast ourselves with old Europe and think of old Europe as being stagnant, class-bound, status-bound. But in terms of the statistics, the income statistics, there's more mobility, but there's more upward mobility in old Europe than there is today in the United States. This wasn't always the case, but it's the way America has become. Another way of seeing the degree of inequality in the United States, inequality of opportunity, is if you look at a young person who born somebody at the top of the income distribution, who does very poorly at school, he will wind up almost certainly having a higher income than somebody from the bottom half who does very well at school. So as I tell my students, the most important decision you can make in your life is choosing the right parents. And once you mess up on that, the game is over. The fourth idea I want to try to bring home is that as the numbers, the stories that I've just told illustrate, there are huge variations in inequality across the world. Huge variations in inequality of opportunity. That tells an important story. Because what it means is it's not just economic forces determining inequality. If we're just economic forces, those economic forces are at play very similar in all the advanced countries. Globalization, technology, these are global forces. Even the most important changes in demography are affecting countries, all the advanced countries, in a fairly similar way. And yet, the outcomes are markedly different. The question is why? And the answer is very clear. It's the policies that we pursue. Different countries have chosen different policies, and those policies, tax policies, education policies, the legal frameworks, antitrust, monopoly laws, labor institutions, corporate governance. In fact, every one of the provisions that describe our economics and social political system, all of these shape our economy. And they shaped our economy in ways that have led to the high level of inequality and the low level of opportunity that we have. These questions about what are the rules, regulations, and how they shape inequality are constantly under debate and discussion. If we have a system, just to give you one example, of a little provision that some just very small provisions that almost nobody even notices, and how they lead to more inequality. So, for instance, one of the things was that in the very important law that provided Medicare Part D prescription drugs, a sentence was inserted that said the U.S. government, the largest purchaser of drugs, could not bargain with the drug companies. They could set whatever price. That gave them enormous monopoly power. That was estimated over a period of 10 years to enrich the coffers of the drug companies by $1 trillion. And that was a transfer payment from ordinary Americans, from the middle and the bottom, to the top. So that's one example. Another one that occurred actually when I was in the Clinton White House, almost went unnoticed, was in 1992, before Clinton took office, there was a lot of concern back then about CEO pay. Let me just explain. It was very small compared to what it was today. But even then, there was concern. And so we proposed a surtax on CEO pay of over $1 million. That seems today like nobody will work for that amount of money. So, but then there was one person in the administration, I'll let you try to figure out who that was. There's one person in the administration who happened to receive the previous year a bonus of $25 million. So he thought this was not quite a good idea. So he put again a little sentence that said, there's an exception for performance pay. Of course, what that led to is everybody started calling their pay performance pay. We saw what that meant in the middle of the 2008 crisis. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, the CEOs of all the banks who had led the country to the brink of ruin, got huge performance bonuses. You have to say, again, this is a science to the extent that people here know mathematics. Sometimes I jokingly say they just got the sign wrong. They should have been a negative bonus, but they made a mistake. They just made it a positive bonus. But a few companies were too embarrassed to call it a performance bonus. They called it a retention bonus. But then you have to ask, why would you want to retain somebody who brought your company to the brink of ruin? But this little provision, one line, led to the growth of stock options. When you think about it, stock options, they reward the CEO if the stock price goes up. You call that an incentive pay. But stock prices go up when interest rates go down. Stock prices go up when we have a bubble, like we've just been having in the stock market. The CEO isn't responsible for the Federal Reserve lowering the interest rates. Take an airline company. If the oil price goes down, the stock of the airline company goes up. Why should he get rewarded for what happens in the Middle East? Or why should he be punished? The point is, the incentive pay, the CEO incentive pay, has almost nothing to do with incentives. It's about enriching the CEOs. And the way I know that, feel that even more firmly, about a year later, again, when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, the issue came up, shouldn't the shareholders know how much the CEO is getting paid? You think, a little issue of transparency. We criticized other countries for not being transparent. A lot of people think that when you give a stock option, it's like manna from heaven. It just comes out of nowhere. But anybody who knows, has taken a first course in physics, knows one of the basic laws is called the conservation of matter. You can't get something from nothing. So when the CEO gets more, somebody else gets less. And the basic principle is dilution of the value of the stock of the other shareholders. And we said, let's have a rule that you make disclosure. You let people, the other shareholders, know how much you're robbing away from them, and then maybe they'll do something about it. Well, the same person who was responsible for putting in the little line about exempting performance pay said, oh no, this will confuse everybody. It's much better to keep it in footnotes that nobody can read, and that way they won't be confused. So the result of this was enormous pressure from the financial community not to disclose, not to have transparency. Arthur Levitt, who was the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, said that his biggest mistake that he ever made when he was head of the SEC, not to force this disclosure, and that was because he was put under this enormous pressure. What I've been emphasizing is just these examples show how detailed laws and regulations, buried in laws that nobody even thinks about, helps create the kind of inequality that we have. And that's why it's really important to follow what are the public policy debates and to see what is being stuffed into the laws behind your back. Right now, there's a very live issue of another example of a set of policies trying to stuffed in a bill that will increase inequality. And that's the new trade agreement. TPP and the Trade Promotion Authority. And I have to say, I have a great deal of admiration for Senator Wyden's position on a fair tax, but I think what he's doing in this Trade Promotion Authority is absolutely, I don't know, I want to use the word criminal, but wrong. The fact that, there are many, many aspects of it. A lot of the attention has been given to the way that it will probably destroy jobs, increase, downward pressure on wages, help outsource jobs to abroad. I want to just very briefly mention two particular aspects that I find most disturbing. The first of these has to do with the access to medicines, to life-saving medicines. In the 1980s, we had a big debate about this issue. There are two kinds of drugs: generics, which are low-priced, and big pharma, the high-priced drugs. And we compromised because the argument was you need to have big pharma to do innovation, although most of the innovation is actually done in our universities, not by big pharma. And at the other extreme are the generics, which provide the drugs at low prices. And so we got this compromise that's worked reasonably well. America still pays higher prices for drugs than any other country, but it's worked to the extent that 86-7% of all drugs are now generics. And if it weren't for the generics, the prices we'd be paying for the drugs would be much, much higher. And in that sense, it's actually worked. Well, what this trade bill will do is upset that careful balance between generics and brand names. It will make it more difficult to bring generics to the market. It will de facto extend the effective patent life of the big pharma's drugs, a process that's sometimes called evergreening. There are lots of very complicated technical provisions called data exclusivity, but these will not stimulate more innovation. They'll actually harm innovation. But what they will unambiguously do is increase the price of the drugs that you pay and the people all over the world pay. To me, it's very strange that Obama is pushing this because his signature achievement has been Obamacare. And the two purposes of Obamacare were to extend coverage and to bring down prices. These provisions will raise prices. The second provision that, to me, is very disturbing is a set of provisions that will make it very difficult to regulate, to increase regulations, to protect the environment, to protect health, to protect worker safety, consumers. And the disputes over these issues will be settled by private courts, by private arbitration panels that are lawyers, often with conflicts of interest, and with judicial processes that don't satisfy the basic principles of modern legal systems. I wrote a letter today with leading lawyers from Harvard Law School, Yale Law School, Berkeley Law School, that you can see in the Washington Post, and I think it'll be circulated more widely, explaining why it is, how it is that this legal system is really counter to all the principles of good judicial principles like appeal, precedence. And most important to me is we've always viewed the judicial process as an essential part of government. That courts are one of the most important things that government provides. The dispute resolution between different individuals are mechanisms that go through courts. But we are now privatizing that process. And when I say that I worry about it, the reason that I worry about it is because essentially identical provisions are already in a number of trade agreements, or they're actually called investment agreements. And we're seeing how that's playing out. Let me just give you one example that brings home how dangerous these provisions are. I don't know how many of you know about 19th century history of trade, but in the 19th century, China and the West had a very big trade imbalance. China had many things that the West wanted, most importantly, significantly, for instance, China, porcelain. And there was a problem. The West had very little that China wanted, so exports and imports were unbalanced. And then the West figured out something that was a good product that it could help redress the trade imbalance. When I teach the students, my students in the business school, one of the things we talk about, what is a good product? One attribute of a good product is repeat purchase. That you want the person, when you sell it once, they keep coming back and back. Well, the West found a really good product that had that property, opium. Because once you try it, you keep coming back. What China figured out after a while that this wasn't so very good for China. And it said, we don't want any more of your opium. And the West said, you're violating a basic right, our basic human right to sell products to you, to kill you. And China didn't back down, and the West had no recourse. It had to go to war. And in fact, not one war, but two wars called the Opium Wars. And as you may know, the West won those wars. That's how it got the concessions along the east coast of China. Well, your government, the United States, is now waging what I call the 21st century opium war. It's not opium, of course. That would be too embarrassing. But it's cigarettes. Cigarettes kill. Cigarettes cause cancer, lung problems. And cigarettes are particularly bad for developing countries because they don't have the money to pay for the health costs that are associated with these diseases. Well, Uruguay and Australia decided they wanted to discourage smoking. And they decided to require labeling of packages, hazardous to your health. They went one step further. They mandated that you have a picture of what a lung looks like of somebody who's been smoking. And it looks pretty ugly. Well, that had the effect that was anticipated. It discouraged people from smoking. And that made Philip Morris very angry because that lost their profits, fewer people to kill. So what did they do? Under these investment agreements, Philip Morris is suing Australia and Uruguay. If they win, these countries will either have to get rid of the regulation and or have to compensate, have to pay Philip Morris for not killing people. They will have to pay Philip Morris for the loss in their expected profits. As I said, the cost of this litigation is very high, and a poor country like Uruguay can't afford it. But fortunately, some of the 1% in the United States are helping out. So it's important to realize that not everything about the 1% is bad. So Mayor Bloomberg and Bill Gates are financing the cost of Uruguay's litigation. But can you imagine that it's taking rich Americans to fend off an onslaught on the health of a poor country? And now the U.S. government wants to extend that to Japan, to all of the Pacific, and to all the Atlantic. And if you wonder why I and a lot of other people feel so passionate about this, it's because it really is changing the rules of the game in a way that's very adverse. Now, what you'll hear from Senator Wyden and what you'll hear from Obama, they sort of read from the same script sheet, and I've seen that kind of script sheet. What they say is, the United States has only faced a limited number of suits, and we've won all of them. Well, companies are learning about how to win suits. They're learning about how to manage this arbitration process. And we haven't had an agreement with a advanced country like Japan or Germany or these other countries where there are very good lawyers, every bit as good as American lawyers, And I can assure you that if we pass this particular provision, they will win many cases. The argument is any new regulation that lowers your expected profits, you can sue. For those who are lawyers, this is called a regulatory taking. And we had, when I was in the Clinton White House, we had a big battle over this. The many anti-environmentalists wanted to have a provision like this because they knew if they had a provision like this, we would not have environmental regulations because we simply couldn't afford it. And both the courts and the Congress turned this down. And now the USTR and the Obama administration are trying to shovel this into a trade agreement. So this is the reason I go on about this is it is both important because it's an important policy issue going on right now, but it's also an example of how we structure our economy, and we structure our economy to create more inequality. In this particular case, not only inequality of income, but also inequality of health. The next point I want to make very quickly is that some people say, well, yes, inequality is not such a good thing. There's a trade-off. But where we are today in the United States, we can't afford to do anything about inequality. Again, I think that's absolutely wrong. And the best way to see that is to go back to the example that I began the story with, the talk with, back to where we were at the end of World War II. We were a much poorer country 70 years ago. We had a debt to GDP ratio of 130%. And just to frame that number, 130%, when Greece went into its crisis in 2010, its debt GDP ratio was only 110%. So it was a significant number, but we didn't let it bother us because we knew that if we grew, we made the right investments, that number would go down from 130% to a much smaller number, and that worked. That strategy of growth worked. But that meant we had to make investments. What was one of the important investments we made? We said that everybody who had fought in the war, which was every able-bodied man and a lot of women, could get a 4-year college education. They could go to the best school that they could get into, and the government would pay for it. It's called the GI Bill. And that played a very important part in creating the middle-class society, bringing us together, and enhancing our economic growth. Now, when President Obama says we ought to have 2 years community college for poor kids, you hear from some people, we can't afford it. How could we afford it then and we can't now? Obviously, the point is that these are matters of choice. We are making choices, and the choices that we're making are affecting the degree of inequality in our society. When I say choices, of course, it's not the people at the bottom that are making the choices, and that goes back to the theme of the Vanity Fair article. It's of the 1%, for the 1%, by the 1%. And that's another important insight into the nature of inequality in the United States. Whenever you have the kind of economic inequality that we have, and the enormous level of economic inequality, it will be translated into political inequality. One of the reasons it gets translated into political inequality is they get to write the rules, and the rules that they write, like appointing Supreme Court justices that make a ruling like Citizens United, give more power to money. So we wind up with a government that is better described as $1 one vote than one person one vote. And that process, of course, leads to this vicious cycle where we have more economic inequality leading to more political inequality, leading to more economic inequality. So just like more economic inequality leads to less equality of opportunity, and that in turn leads to more inequality of income, we have several vicious circles going on, and that in turn has one important implication. If we don't do something about our problem, it's likely to get worse. Before coming to the last few comments I want to make, I want to emphasize that just like this inequality is undermining our democracy, it's also affecting our society. One of the essays in the book, I talk about trust and the way that the way our economy has evolved, the way a system of this great divide has helped erode trust in our society. And no economy can function, and no society can function without trust. One of the things I began this talk with, talking about Baltimore, it becomes very clear that there's a lack of trust in our justice system. There's a lack of trust in our police system. And for good reasons. Another essay in this book, Great Divide, I talk about an important dimension of our inequality. I've talked about inequality, income, wealth, opportunity. An important dimension of inequality is equality of access to justice. The trade agreement I just mentioned is one where, because it's very high cost, means some people, rich corporations, have access to a kind of judicial system that ordinary Americans don't. But we saw that over and over again. In the financial debacle that led up to the Great Recession, there were an enormous number of misdeeds, to put it mildly, by our bankers. They engaged in market manipulation, manipulating the LIBOR, the foreign exchange markets. They committed perjury, saying that they had looked at homeowners, what they owed, and that they saw that these people that they were asking the court to throw out of their homes, that they actually owed the money that they owed. They engaged in predatory lending, discriminatory lending, 40 years after we passed laws against that. They committed all of these, what I could say, crimes. But none of them, essentially none of them, have been prosecuted. But meanwhile, our judicial system has thrown out of homes people who owed nothing, because they couldn't access the kind of lawyers that would defend them against the banks. So another little refrain in one of the essays is we say in our Pledge of Allegiance, we say, with justice for all. And the new way should be with justice for all who can afford it. Well, I've talked a lot about not just about inequality at the top. I've talked about the increase in poverty at the bottom. But one of the most disturbing aspects of what's happened in America is the evisceration of the middle class. I talked about the stagnation of income, but equally, the basic necessities of what used to be called a middle-class lifestyle are becoming increasingly difficult to attain. I mentioned before that the importance of education. If you can't get a college education, when I talked before, that the median income of the United States has been stagnant for a quarter of a century. But if you don't have a college education, incomes have actually been plummeting. But unfortunately, tuitions have been going up, and median incomes of most Americans have been stagnating. And the result of that is a college education is becoming increasingly difficult to attain. Only way that people do that is by borrowing. And that debt is impairing our economy. Student debt now exceeds credit card debt. The average American student graduates with $25,000 of debt, but that's an average. There are many students graduating with $100,000, and today, a college education today is like a high school education used to be. To get really ahead, you need an advanced degree, and to get an advanced degree, people graduate with debts of a couple $100,000. Other countries have done a better job of addressing that. Again, these are matters of choices. There are other ways of making access to education available for all, and we've chosen not to do it. Well, I want to conclude by emphasizing that the problems I've stressed here, the problems of this growing inequality, an inequality that's been growing over a third of a century, won't be solved by minor tweaks. It won't be solved by addressing some symptoms, but it's absolutely necessary to address the symptoms because addressing the underlying problems will take a long time. It's taken 35 years to get the level of inequality, and it will take a long time to undo it. So we have to have a two-track approach. We have to have major reforms in the way our economic system works, and we have to prevent things from getting worse. But we also have to think about how do we make, once again, the basic aspects of a middle-class society once again attainable. Things like education, home ownership, healthcare, even getting to work, childcare, child leave. And so there's a rich agenda here that I talk about in several of the essays in this book. Let me just conclude with a note of urgency. As I said, it's taken 35 years to get to where we are today. But the decisions that we make now, if we, for instance, go ahead and adopt this trade agreement, will bake in the way our economy performs for the next 35 years. So unless we start making the change, unless we start doing things like increasing minimum wage, making sure that there's access to a good college education for all, trying to do something about monopoly power, corporate governance, unless we begin making those changes now, it is likely that we will continue in the current course and things will get worse and worse. I've seen the consequences. I travel a lot around the world. I've seen countries where the divide has gotten greater and greater, where the Great Divide is greater even than in the United States. And I don't think any of us would like to live in those kinds of countries. And so what I hope that people get out of reading this book and out of this talk is a sense of urgency that there is an important election coming up. Too often in the past, there's been a sense of feeling that voting doesn't matter. After all, the 1% is going to make the decisions. But we are still a democracy, and there's still hope. And at other junctures in our history, we have pulled back from the brink. But it's only been because of the demand of people who are concerned about the direction that our economy is taking. So with that, let me open it to questions, and thank you for being so patient. Okay. So there are a couple of mics here, so I guess you just come to the front and ask your questions. And he's supposed to say that be short, don't make speeches, so that a lot of people in a democratic sense can ask questions. And I'll try to be short, but I have a little bit of a problem sometimes. You have to understand, as a teacher, the natural unit of time is 50 minutes. And that's just the way time is structured. Okay, anyway.
Who are you supporting for president in 2016?
What? I didn't hear.
Who are you supporting for president in 2016?
Oh, well, almost,
Yeah.
we don't yet know the full list of candidates.
But
And right now, I think the major focus of concern is to make sure that all the candidates in both parties, but especially in the Democratic Party, respond to the kind of agenda that I put forward. And we're working on it with some hope.
I just want to ask a couple of questions. One is that you talk about peace and justice. A part of the three-legged stool of democracy. We don't talk about equitable distribution of natural resources. And I think one of the ways to solve the problems is to make sure at the development of any natural resources, which is how capital is created, that we somehow make sure that that understanding of the paradigm shift, that the natural resources belong to everybody.
No, I agree with you very much. And one aspect of that that I've been concerned about for a long time is that the resources, particularly, say, in public land, that when we have somebody develop them, they pay a competitive price. In other words, we own the resources, and we as citizens own the resources, and we ought to get full market value for that. And unfortunately, that's often not the case. For instance, in the case of minerals, people just have to take a stake, and we get a very small fraction of the value of those minerals.
But once people own the natural resources in part of this earth, then I think we take environmental responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so just one more added I just want to say is that we stop talking about all the peripheral issues, but we can't talk about it until we don't have ownership.
Yeah. So what I think is there are a couple of issues here. One of them is environmental justice is one of the important aspects of inequality in our society. One of the striking things is that children born in poor families are more exposed to environmental hazards. And there are interesting experiments, just very briefly, have shown the magnitude of what. There was a natural experiment. In New Jersey, they put in automatic toll booths. And the problem with the old toll booths is that when people stopped, their carbon monoxide would get produced. And after the automatic toll booths were put in, they did a study of the birth weight of babies born after that, and they were significantly increased. In other words, the carbon monoxide had led to lower birth weight, and we know from other studies that lower birth weight is associated with all kinds of lower performance. So, yeah, environmental issues, equality issues are very important. One of the important aspects, let me just put, one of the things I had wanted to talk about was there's a big discussion a year ago. Piketty's book came out called Capitalism in the 21st Century, Capital in the 21st Century. I've criticized in a couple of the essays in this book Piketty's view because he seems to suggest that it's mostly about capital. It's inevitable. It's about the nature of the capitalist system. And what I've emphasized in my talk and in these essays, that it's about the choices we make. It's about our policies, and it's about our politics. A very different view that we, in some sense, my book is much more hopeful, because if it's inevitable, then there's not much we can do about it. But if it's our policy, we can do something about it. But Piketty talks about the increase in the wealth-income ratio. That's a very big part of that. The interesting thing is the major part of the increase in the wealth-income ratio is the value of land and other natural resources. And that has led to a discussion. One of the most interesting 19th century proposals for progressive taxation was an idea called Henry George. And he talked about a land tax. And it was basically saying, who owns it is not so, manages is not so important. What is really important is that because these resources are inelastically supplied and are basically part of our endowment,
that's right.
The revenues from them ought to belong to all the people.
And we should watch for Elizabeth Warren.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the minimum wage. Tomorrow's May Day, and some of us will have a chance to go to protests in favor of raising the wage to $15. Those who can't participate may want to get involved in some other way. And I'm actually wondering, do you think people should go to such protests? And if the answer is more complicated than just supporting it or not, how is it more complicated? What would be a good sign to bring?
No, I think it is a good thing to do. I think, May Day has always been symbolic of worker rights. The fact, as I said before, that minimum wage, the wage at the bottom adjusted for inflation is basically the same as it was a half century ago. And that should be unacceptable in our society. There was, some time ago, a debate about would there be adverse effects of raising the minimum wage? Would it lead to unemployment going up? And would the poor then be the people who suffer the most? There have now been a host of studies showing, and actually the Congressional Budget Office looked at over 100 studies, and there's a range of estimates, but for the overwhelming evidence is that will not have a significant negative effect, and a lot of evidence that it may even have a positive effect. The reason it will have a positive effect is that the real problem in our economy right now, the reason why we were growing so slowly, 0.2%, one of the reasons why the economy has had such a weak recovery from the 2007 recession and 2008 crisis is lack of demand. And the reason there's lack of demand is lack of income. If people who don't have any income, they're not going to spend any money. And it's a vicious circle. You raise the income of the people at the bottom, they'll spend it. You raise the income of the people at the top, they save a very large fraction of their income. And so the net result in our current context is that it will stimulate the economy. The other big change in terms of the minimum wage that has occurred is it used to be that a lot of the people in the bottom at the minimum wage were teenagers, a supplementary job. That's not true today. A very large fraction of those working at the minimum wage are the major breadwinner in the family. So you're really talking about moving people out of poverty. What is striking about our politics, I mentioned several times about the relationship of politics and economics. What's striking about our politics is that 70% of all Americans support an increase in the minimum wage. But we can't get it through Washington. Now, can you imagine that? And this is supposed to be a democracy. So the only way we're getting it through is local action. And we're seeing it working. Seattle sort of led the way, $15. And that's having an effect. Last Wednesday, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, announced that a commitment to move 800,000 New Yorkers out of poverty. And the major instrument is the raising the minimum wage. So if we can make this a national movement, I think it will lead to effects, not only in a local level, but actually change the dynamics of the coming 2016 election.
So should we go to the protests?
Yes.
Okay, go. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead.
In all my readings, 1979, 1980 seems to be a turning point. That after that, the neoliberals came in and we started down this path. Do you have any idea why? I mean, I've read I've heard all the statistics about what we did, but why did we start letting that happen? Did we just become more crass?
Yeah, well, as I said, I tried to suggest a couple of the reasons. One of them was the fading out of the kind of social cohesion that we had after World War II. The other one was there was the period of the 70s was marked by this high levels of inflation. Inflation got into double digit. People thought our economic system wasn't working. They weren't really able to grasp how bad it was going to get. And then there are both interest and ideas. The idea that incentives really mattered, the Chicago kind of ideas, became very widespread. I don't want to underestimate the importance of ideas. Of course, I'm in the ideas business, but it had a very big effect. And there were clearly lots of people who preferred paying 35% tax rates rather than 91% tax rates. And they were willing to spend a lot of money to shape our politics. So I think it's a confluence of all of those together that led to this dramatic change. What has upset me, and it shows the power of ideas and influence, is that the extent to which some of those ideas continued into the 90s. You know, they were already, by 1989, we were seeing that deregulation had led to the S&L crisis. We were seeing that things weren't going very well, yet we didn't change course. And in the 90s, we had more financial market deregulation. Some of the things I talked about this evening, some of the policies that made things, I think, worse, were enacted. And it became almost a part of the mantra that you needed these reforms. And now, as I say, now that we've had a third of a century, I think we can say with some clear, definitive perspective that they failed.
I ask you to imagine a society, a large population, in which one person has property rights to everything. All of the other people have no property rights, a Gini coefficient of 1. And it has a hypothetical government, an institution. People in that society probably wouldn't have a problem with saying that the person, even the person with everything, would probably agree that government worked pretty good for them. And it didn't work so good for the rest of the people. And thus, taxation is kind of the payment that you make for the government working for you. The institution actually succeeded in your case. But if you change the distributions from a Gini coefficient of 1 to some other distribution of incomes and wealth over the populace, we lose that narrative. We lose that kind of political discussion. And I was wondering, as a person who has a lot of policy experience, why do we lose control of the narrative in a situation in which there's still a small concentration of people with a lot of stuff who the government is working quite good for, and they can sell the narrative that taxation is somehow stealing from them or taking their property rights is unfair, as opposed to the idea that it's payment for the government having worked so well for them?
So one of the questions that puzzled me, has puzzled me for a long time, is how in a democracy where the people in the middle, the outcome of our political process should be one that reflects the interest of society as a whole, do we wind up with laws, regulations that seem to be so weighted, tilted towards the 1%? And part of this, as I say, has to do with the role of money in the political process, but the question is, how does that play out? One of the ways that it plays out is in their ability to tell a narrative, to sell a story. You may have gathered that I'm not very happy with cigarettes, but one of the things that was quite striking about the cigarette companies is they persuaded people all over the country that the concerns about smoking were exaggerated. They had an advertising campaign saying that there was still not scientific evidence that it caused cancer and other diseases. I mean, it was striking because in their own files they had the evidence, so they knew they were lying. And there's been a lot of suits as a result of that. But we know from those suits that they knew that it caused cancer, and yet they figured out how to persuade a vast majority, a very large number of Americans, that it was otherwise. Well, if you can persuade people to buy a product that kills you, you can persuade people to buy ideas that are also not so good. And they've done that. So part of this are the various narratives, and there are lots of them, and I can't go through them. And in the essays here, I do talk about some of those narratives. So one of the narratives is the rich, the people at the top, are the job creators. And you have to give them money to get the jobs created. And it's a new version of trickle-down economics. Well, let me tell you, energy, creativity, entrepreneurship are spread, I think, throughout the American population. It's everywhere. What creates jobs is demand. Whenever there is demand, jobs get created. And when there's not demand, jobs don't get created. It's really that simple. And unfortunately, when you put all the money at the top, there's not a lot of demand, and that weakens the economy. So it's actually, in that sense, they're more described as job destroyers. But this narrative of the people at the top being the job creators has been very forceful in affecting the debate. So that's just one example. And one of the things that I think is very important, and what I try to do in some of these essays, is to tell other stories, other narratives, and try to undermine these particular narratives and explain why they're wrong. Because these ideas have sufficient currency that they have to be undermined. In the same way, like the story of incentives. You can't work if you don't have incentives. The fact was, as I mentioned, 91% tax rate, we worked very well. The fact that the CEO incentives have nothing to do with incentives is another story. It's a story, but it's a story that has nothing to do with reality. And another way of thinking about it that I try to tell here, another way to think about it is, would any of you say that you need you're having, say, a heart surgery, and your doctor says to you, I need incentive pay? I'll tell you what, if I succeed and you don't die, I want you to pay me $10,000, and if you die, you only have to pay me $5,000. Now, and the doctor says, I need incentive pay. I mean, after all, I have to focus my attention. I could be thinking about so many other things. If the doctor said to that, what would you say to him? You probably don't want him to be giving you open heart surgery, right? You have a company, you're paying a guy $5 million, $10 million. You would think that would get some of his attention and that he would be working all out for you. And then he comes to you and say, by the way, $10 million isn't quite enough. If you really want me to keep off the golf course, you really have to give me, a bonus based on how well my stock price does, depending on what the Federal Reserve does. Now, do you think that's the kind of CEO that you would want? And yet this story that you need incentive pay to incentivize people to work well, so different from the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of people that we respect, is an example of another narrative, another story that's being sold. And what is really important, that we unsell that story and demolish it.
Thank you for your ideas and your leadership. My question comes in the spirit of wanting to broaden the resonance, political resonance of the ideas we've been talking about tonight, and you've been writing about for a long time. In their book, The Spirit Level, Wilkinson and Pickett presented a very, I thought, persuasive array of demonstrations that income inequality, whether you consider it across countries or even among states in America, has many, many parallels that aren't just economic. Public health, longevity, measured levels of happiness and trust, such as you were talking about. All of those things don't just follow the distribution of income. The average levels themselves in a society or in a state depend on the degree of inequality. So it's not only the people who can afford health care in the United States who will be better off if we have less inequality. It will be everyone, essentially, according to Wilkinson and Pickett. And I think there are strategies for broadening the way we frame the discourse of inequality to get outside of just the economic realm and the existing narratives that are harder to work with, I think, because of the history we've had with them. And so I'm wondering if, what ideas you might have about that.
I very much agree with you, and I think the example you give is a very apt one. The NIH, the National Institute of Health, has looked at this question in some detail. Many of you may know that while we spend more than any other country, both as a percentage and absolute dollars, on health, about 17% of GDP, our health statistics are among the worst of the advanced countries. Just to give you one number, Australia spends 8% of their GDP, and they have a life expectancy 3 years longer. That's a big deal in terms of life expectancy, but that's just symptomatic of better health more generally. What is striking, and echoes what you said, is that if you look at even people with insurance in the United States actually have worse health than in other countries. And that's given rise to a discussion. Why is that? So we all know access to health insurance is important, but what are the other attributes? So these are higher income people in the United States, comparable income people in, say, UK. We do worse. And one of the arguments one of the interpretations of what has gone on is it's very stressful to live in a society with a lot of inequality. If you fall down, there's a long way to go. There's no safety net, there's no system of social protection, and so it's not only you falling down, you worry about your children, because you know that their prospects, if they don't get into the best school, their life prospects are not going to be very good. So it creates a lot of stress, and stress is very bad for health. So, I think the general point, though, is the one that I tried to echo before, that it's no longer do we see this as a trade-off. We can actually all be better off if we have a more equal society. A lot of the people at the top understand that. A lot of the people at the top are actually working to create a more equal society. Unfortunately, a lot of the others are trying to create a more unequal society. So it's a real battle.
Yes, quick.
Yeah.
Everyone hates taxes. Do you think it would be a feasible way to, when people file their taxes, they also file what they want to spend their taxes on and what they do not want to spend their taxes on?
Yeah, I think that thinking through ways of getting better information about people's preferences is important. Restricting it to that would undermine the public good, the ability to you could imagine very wealthy people saying, I want the money to be spent just on me. Okay, that will undermine all of what we're trying to do. But certainly as a way of eliciting better what people really care about, I think it is important.
I'm an economics major at Portland State, and I chose that mostly because of an interest in inequality. So I've taken a class on alternatives to capitalism, and right now I'm taking a class on Marxist political economy. And both of these professors say that it's okay now to talk about inequality as an economist, but you have to distance yourself from Marx in order to be taken seriously. Do you think that there is any place for Marx in the modern discussion of inequality?
Well, there are, Marx had when people today talk about Marx, they quite often give a modern interpretation. A lot has happened in 150 years, and when people refer to John Stuart Mill, he was writing about a very different economy. Even people writing 100 years ago or 50 years ago, they're describing a manufacturing economy. Then they were talking about mostly agriculture, moving into manufacturing. Now we're going from manufacturing to the service sector, a knowledge economy. All of these are very different structures to our economy. There were two ideas that I think are important in Marx. One is that a notion of power and exploitation. that it's just not competitive markets where no one has power. That's the sort of been the paradigm in economics. I've become very convinced that, and I try to, in this talk about, monopoly power is real. We've changed the you might say, the power of workers by weakening unions. The power of CEOs is real. So that notion of power, hard to define, but is real, and that's one important thing. The corresponding notion of exploitation. Clearly, we have a lot of exploitation, and he talked about the exploitation of workers. You can't call, the workers who are working at the minimum wage today, that's a form of exploitation. So clearly, those ideas are relevant. The second one he talked about is the nexus between politics and economics, which economists didn't want to talk about. They tried to talk about markets as if they were determined by natural law, as if there was no underlying politics in it. And we now, as I stress, we know that that's wrong. So those are ideas that he raised and have a lot of validity to them.
Thank you. Coming back to your assertion that there need be no trade-off between inequality and growth, or rather preventing inequality and growth, and in light of the celerity with which we're approaching the planet's biophysical limits, don't you think it might be time to open a dialogue on a post-growth or no-growth economy?
Well, there are different kinds of growth. Not all growth has to be as resource intensive and make the adverse impact on our environment as the current growth. If we've talked about taxes, revenues. One of the things I'm very strongly in favor of, say, is a carbon tax and other environmental taxes that will provide incentives so we change the structure of the economy so that more people would come and sit and listen to hot air like mine rather than other forms of material production that has a much bigger carbon footprint. So, how you measure it is really difficult, whether GDP is actually growing when this is happening or not. These are really very subtle things, and people, I headed an international commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, and, let me just say, whether our measured GDP is going up or down isn't really relevant. It's still the case that there are a lot of people in the United States that don't have the basic requirements for living a basic life. And it's important for them to be able to do that. And we have to have enough growth to ensure that that can happen. But whether the future of our growth will be more of a service sector, I think it is going to be imperative, given as you say, the confines of our planet. That is one of the physical laws that we have to deal with, like the conservation of matter. And doing that means that we will have to change the structure of our economy.
Throughout the course of human history, has there ever been an instance in which the Great Divide has actually been reversed? And if not, what makes you think America is going to be an exception?
Yeah, there are instances in which it's reversed. Actually, in our own history, we reversed it twice. We did at the end of the Gilded Age in the 19th century, when inequality, the robber barons had hit very high levels. That was followed in the United States by the Progressive Era, bipartisan. And then the Roaring 20s was another period in which inequality reached a very high level, and that was followed by the social legislation of the 30s, and then the Great Consensus, the great period of social cohesion following World War II. Other countries have also actually having lower inequality. Brazil is one of the countries over the last 20-some years where they saw that they had reached very high levels of inequality, and they said that, they approaching a brink, and they needed to reverse it. And again, there was both center-left and center-right parties said we have to change the course that our country, and they succeeded. And you can see it in the data. The level of inequality has come down. So maybe that's a good way to end. There is hope.
lot of depressing statistics this evening. You should leave here not feeling very good.